The 13th of May 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. Captain Giuseppe Traante stood frozen in the scorching desert heat, both hands raised high above his head, watching American tanks roll toward him through suffocating clouds of golden dust. His throat burned like fire. His uniform was plastered to his skin with sand and dried sweat, and racing through his mind was a single, paralyzing thought: this is where I die. For months, fascist newspapers had poisoned Italian minds with horror stories about American brutality. The Americans were monsters, they said, gangsters in uniforms who tortured prisoners, worked them until they collapsed, shot them for entertainment. Giuseppe had believed every single word. Why wouldn't he? These stories came from his own government, the people he was supposed to trust. The American sergeant walking toward him had a face carved from stone, eyes hidden behind dust-covered goggles. Giuseppe thought about those stories, the work camps, the beatings, the screams. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him when he was just a boy, waiting for the rifle butt to smash into his face, the boot to crack his ribs. Instead, the sergeant lowered his rifle, reached for his canteen, and offered it to Giuseppe. Giuseppe stared at that canteen like it was some kind of impossible mirage shimmering in the heat. Water. The American, his enemy, the man who had just defeated him in battle, was offering him water. His hands trembled violently as he took it and drank. The water was warm, tasted like metal. But in that moment, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced in his entire life. He searched the sergeant's face desperately for signs of cruelty, for the trap he knew was coming. He found nothing, just humanity. What happened next, over the following days, weeks, and months, would completely shatter everything Giuseppe Traante thought he knew about Americans. Within 6 months, he wouldn't just be surviving in an American prison camp. He'd be running his own restaurant, and his life would never be the same. Giuseppe's journey into American captivity began with confusion and fear that wouldn't leave him alone. After surrendering in Tunisia, he and hundreds of other Italian soldiers were herded into a makeshift processing center in the middle of the desert. Giuseppe braced himself for interrogation, for beatings, for starvation. Instead, they were given medical examinations. A young American medic, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, cleaned the infected cut on Giuseppe's arm with surprising, almost shocking gentleness. The medic even smiled and handed Giuseppe a cigarette. An American cigarette. Lucky strike. They're fattening us up for harder work later, Giuseppe whispered to the soldier next to him, a private from Naples named Antonio. That evening, they were given food, not scraps, not moldy bread covered in mold. Actual food, canned beef, crackers, real coffee. Not the chicory substitute they'd been choking down in the Italian army for months. Giuseppe ate slowly, suspiciously, waiting for someone to snatch it all away. No one did. The next morning, they were loaded onto trucks heading for the port. An elderly Italian colonel stumbled while climbing aboard. Giuseppe tensed, expecting the Americans to laugh or shove the old man roughly to the ground. Instead, a young American private caught him and helped him up. "Easy there, sir," the boy said gently, steadying the colonel's elbow. Giuseppe kept watching, waiting for the trap to spring. It never did. At the port of Oran, they boarded a Liberty ship bound for America. The crossing took 16 days. They were cramped below deck with 800 other Italian prisoners of war, but they were fed twice daily. And one night, an American sailor, whose grandmother had come from Sicily, tried speaking to them in broken Italian, asking about their families, showing them photos of his own. Giuseppe studied this young sailor carefully. He had an open face, an easy smile. He shared his cigarettes freely. He laughed when the Italian prisoners tried teaching him proper pronunciation. And Giuseppe couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been told. When the ship finally docked at Norfolk, Virginia on the 3rd of June 1943, Giuseppe stepped onto American soil, still completely uncertain of what came next. The United States would hold 51,000 Italian prisoners during the war. Over 99% would survive to return home. In Japanese camps, barely 60% of Allied prisoners made it out alive. Giuseppe was about to learn exactly why. Camp Ruston, Louisiana, July 1943. Located 60 miles east of Shreveport in Pine Country, Giuseppe's first glimpse of his new prison was surreal. Yes, there were guard towers. Yes, there was barbed wire stretching into the distance. But beyond that, the camp looked less like a prison and more like a small town. Rows of wooden barracks, freshly painted white. A mess hall. A recreation area with volleyball nets already set up. There was even a small chapel. The towering pine forest reminded Giuseppe painfully of the mountains north of Bologna of home. The camp commander, Colonel James Mitchell, addressed them through an interpreter on their first day. "You are prisoners of war," he said, his voice firm but not cruel. "You will work as permitted under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly and with respect. Provided you follow camp rules, you will be paid for your labor. 10 cents per day in camp script. Violence will not be tolerated. Escape attempts will be punished. But while you are here, you will be treated as soldiers, not as slaves." Giuseppe glanced at Antonio. The trap would reveal itself eventually. He was absolutely sure of it. But weeks passed. And the trap never came. The work they were assigned was agricultural labor, picking cotton, harvesting vegetables on nearby farms. It was hard, back-breaking work. Giuseppe's back ached every single evening. But they worked 8-hour shifts with breaks, and they received the same rations as American soldiers. More food than Giuseppe had seen in the last year of serving in the Italian army. White bread, fresh meat, vegetables, real butter. Camp Ruston held 4,000 Italian prisoners of war. That 10 cents per day they earned was about $1.50 in today's money. Not much, but more than they'd ever earned in Mussolini's army. And they could actually spend it. At the camp canteen. By September 1943, Giuseppe had been at Camp Ruston for 2 months. The initial fear had faded, replaced by a strange sort of restless boredom. He was safe, he was fed, but he was also a prisoner. Separated from his family, with no idea when or if he would ever see them again. One evening, Giuseppe walked past the camp recreation hall and noticed something that stopped him cold. American guards and Italian prisoners were playing cards together. Not forced interaction, not guarded hostility, just men playing cards, laughing, arguing over hands in a mixture of broken English and broken Italian. Giuseppe watched, fascinated, as Sergeant Tom O'Brien, an Irish-American guard from Boston, tried explaining poker to a group of Italians who kept trying to turn it into scopa. "You're doing it wrong," O'Brien laughed. No flush beat straight. In Italy, one prisoner countered with a grin. "We play properly." They were smiling, all of them. Giuseppe found himself pulled into the game. Within an hour, he was teaching O'Brien Italian card games while learning poker in return. O'Brien pulled out a battered photograph. 2 little girls in matching dresses, smiling on a front porch. "Mary and Catherine," he said softly. 7 and 9. Giuseppe showed him the picture he carried in his wallet, now creased and worn from being touched so many times. His wife Maria. And little Sophia, 3 years old, holding a doll. "Pretty girls," O'Brien said quietly. "This damn war." Neither man had to say more. They both understood perfectly. "My Angela looks like your Maria," O'Brien continued. "Dark hair. Nice smile. You'll see her again, Captain. This war won't last forever." Giuseppe felt something crack inside his chest. Hope, maybe. Or just the sudden realization that this American sergeant saw him not as an enemy, but as another man who desperately missed his family. That night, Giuseppe couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what his fascist officers had told him about Americans. Everything had been lies. But why? Why had his own government lied so completely, so thoroughly? What happened next would have been impossible to imagine in any German or Japanese prisoner of war camp. In October 1943, a group of Italian prisoners at Camp Ruston approached Colonel Mitchell with an unusual, almost absurd proposal. Several of them had been cooks, bakers, and restaurant workers in civilian life. They wanted to open a small cafe in the camp. Nothing elaborate. Just a place where prisoners could spend their camp script on coffee, pastries, and simple Italian meals. Giuseppe expected an immediate rejection. This was a prison camp. You didn't run businesses in prison camps. Colonel Mitchell surprised everyone. "Submit a proper proposal," he said calmly. "Show me your business plan. If it's reasonable and doesn't violate camp regulations, I'll consider it." Giuseppe, who had managed his family's trattoria in Bologna before the war, joined the planning committee, working with Antonio and 3 other Italian prisoners, including a baker from Rome named Franco and a chef from Milan named Roberto. They drafted a real proposal. They would use their combined camp script earnings to buy basic ingredients from the base commissary. They would prepare food in a designated area of the mess hall during off hours. They would price items reasonably. Any profits would be split among the workers and reinvested in the business. Colonel Mitchell approved it. The Caffè Italiano opened in November 1943 in a corner of the camp recreation hall. It was modest, a few tables, a small preparation area, a hand-painted sign. But to the Italian prisoners of war it was a miracle. Giuseppe and his partners prepared real Italian coffee. Biscotti made with eggs purchased from the commissary and simple pasta dishes. The cafe became a gathering place where Italian prisoners could sip espresso and pretend, just for a few precious moments, that they were back home. But something even more remarkable happened. American guards started coming too. Sergeant O'Brien became a regular customer. He would sit with Giuseppe, drinking what they both knew was a terrible American approximation of cappuccino, talking about their families, their lives before the war. Other guards followed. Giuseppe charged 15 cents for espresso, 50% more than the camp canteen's American coffee. The guards paid it gladly. Worth every penny, O'Brien would say, sipping the bitter brew. Reminds me of Boston's North End. Soon, the cafe was a genuinely integrated space. American guards and Italian prisoners sharing tables, sharing stories, sharing humanity. Giuseppe would stand behind his small counter making coffee and marvel at the complete absurdity of it all. He was a prisoner of war running a restaurant in an enemy prison camp. The Americans were paying him. They were protecting his business. They were treating it seriously, professionally, as if he were a legitimate proprietor rather than a defeated enemy soldier. In Italy, he wrote to Maria in a letter that would take months to reach her through Red Cross channels. They told us Americans were savages without culture. But these men, they respect craftsmanship. They appreciate good food. They treat me like a human being, not an animal. I don't understand them, but I'm beginning to admire them. Later surveys would show that 85% of Italian prisoners of war left American captivity with positive views of the United States. Many credited their camp experiences with opening their eyes to democratic values. Giuseppe was one of them. 3 incidents crystallized Giuseppe's transformation from fearful prisoner to something else entirely. In December 1943, Franco the baker received devastating news. His brother had been killed fighting in Italy. He collapsed in grief. Unable to work, Giuseppe expected the guards to force him back to the kitchen immediately. Instead, Colonel Mitchell granted Franco 3 days of mourning leave, unpaid time to grieve properly. O'Brien and several other guards attended a small memorial service the Italian prisoners held in the chapel. "I'm sorry for your loss," O'Brien told Franco, his hand resting gently on the weeping man's shoulder. "War is hell for everyone." Even in their humanity, the Americans maintained principles. In February 1944, a new prisoner arrived at Camp Ruston, a hardcore fascist officer who immediately began causing trouble. He tried intimidating other prisoners into refusing work, calling them traitors for cooperating with Americans. Giuseppe watched nervously as Colonel Mitchell handled the situation. The fascist expected martyrdom, perhaps even wanted it. He got solitary confinement and a stern lecture about camp rules. No beatings, no torture, just firm, fair discipline. Giuseppe understood something profound in that moment. The Americans didn't need brutality to maintain order. They had something far more powerful: consistent rules applied equally to everyone. In March 1944, Giuseppe received his first letter from Maria. It had taken 9 agonizing months to reach him through Red Cross channels. She and Sophia were alive, hungry, frightened by the Allied bombing of Bologna, but alive. Giuseppe read that letter 17 times, tears streaming down his face. That evening, Sergeant O'Brien found him in the cafe, staring at nothing. "Bad news from home?" O'Brien asked gently. Giuseppe shook his head slowly. "Good news. My family is alive. But Bologna is being bombed." He looked up at O'Brien, his voice breaking. "American bombs." He expected justification, perhaps mockery, maybe even anger. Instead, O'Brien's face filled with genuine sadness. "I'm sorry. the sergeant said quietly. "I'm sorry your family is suffering. I'm sorry about all of it. War shouldn't happen to families." Giuseppe stared at this American sergeant, this man whose country's bombs were falling on Bologna, whose planes had killed Franco's brother, apologizing with genuine sorrow. In that moment, Giuseppe understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The enemy wasn't evil. The enemy was just the enemy. Men doing what their countries asked of them. Men who would rather be home with their families. "You're not what they told us you were," Giuseppe said in halting English. O'Brien smiled sadly. "No one ever is, Captain. No one ever is." Giuseppe nodded slowly. He finally understood. The treatment Giuseppe experienced wasn't an anomaly. It was American policy. In 1942, as the United States prepared to receive thousands of Axis prisoners of war, the War Department made a strategic decision that would change everything. America would strictly adhere to the Geneva Convention, not just in letter but in spirit. The Pentagon understood something profound that many nations missed. Reputation mattered. Every Italian soldier who surrendered and lived to tell about good treatment was a walking advertisement that undermined enemy propaganda. Why fight to the death if surrender meant safety, food, and respect? But beyond strategy, there was genuine belief at work. Men like Colonel Mitchell believed in fundamental human dignity. They saw the Geneva Convention not as an inconvenient rule, but as a moral framework that separated civilization from barbarism. This philosophy extended throughout the entire American prisoner of war system. Of the approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners of war held in camps across the United States, 51,000 Italians, 370,000 Germans, 4,000 Japanese, the vast majority received similar treatment. They worked. They were paid. They had access to recreation, education, and religious services. The International Red Cross conducted regular inspections. Their reports consistently noted good conditions, adequate food, proper medical care, and adherence to Geneva Convention standards. Meanwhile, approximately 90,000 American prisoners of war were held in German camps and 27,000 in Japanese camps. The experiences were vastly horrifically different. In German stalags, conditions were harsh, but generally within convention bounds. In Japanese camps, conditions were nightmarish: starvation rations, routine beatings, forced labor, deliberate medical neglect. Actions spoke louder than words. America's adherence to international law sent a message far more powerful than any propaganda broadcast. We take our principles seriously, even when no one is watching, even when our enemies don't reciprocate. Giuseppe learned these facts after the war. They confirmed what he had experienced firsthand. The 8th of May 1945. The war in Europe ended. Giuseppe stood in the camp yard at Ruston, listening to the announcement crackle over the loudspeaker, and wept. Not from joy. The joy would come later. In that moment, he wept from relief and from uncertainty about what came next. Repatriation took time. Giuseppe remained at Camp Ruston until August 1945, continuing to run Caffè Italiano, continuing to serve coffee to American guards who had become, impossibly, his friends. On his last day at the camp, Sergeant O'Brien gave him a gift, a small American flag and a note. Remember, O'Brien had written in careful handwriting, that enemies can become friends. Come back to America someday. As a visitor this time, Giuseppe sailed back to Italy in September 1945, his duffel bag stuffed with American coffee and chocolate bars for Sofia. He found Bologna damaged but recovering, healing slowly. Maria and Sofia had survived the war, thin and frightened but alive. In September 1945, in Bologna, Giuseppe knocked on a door he had dreamed about for 2 years. It opened. Maria stood there, older, thinner but alive. Giuseppe, he dropped his duffel bag. Chocolate bars scattered across the floor. Gifts for Sofia he'd completely forgotten he was holding. "I'm home," he whispered. The reunion was everything he had dreamed of and more. But Giuseppe carried something else back to Italy. Something invisible but powerful. A completely transformed worldview. In 1946, Giuseppe reopened the family trattoria in Bologna. He named it Caffè Americano in honor of his experience. The restaurant became a gathering place for former Italian prisoners of war who had been held in American camps. They would meet, drink American-style coffee, which Giuseppe had learned to make properly at Camp Ruston, and talk about their experiences. We were the lucky ones, Giuseppe would tell his daughter Sophia years later. We saw the real America, not the propaganda version, not the Hollywood version, the real thing, and it changed us forever. Giuseppe never forgot his promise to Sergeant O'Brien. In 1952, he traveled to America as a tourist, bringing Maria and 12-year-old Sophia with him. They visited Boston, where O'Brien, now a police officer, gave them a personal tour of the city. The two former enemies embraced like brothers. Giuseppe maintained correspondence with O'Brien until the sergeant's death in 1979. He attended the funeral, traveling all the way from Bologna at age 68 to honor the man who had shown him that enemies could become friends. Giuseppe's story was repeated thousands of times across post-war Europe. Italian prisoners of war who had experienced American captivity returned home with changed perspectives on democracy and American values. Many became active in Italy's post-war reconstruction and democratic reforms. They had seen how democratic institutions worked in America, not perfectly, but effectively. They had experienced fair treatment under rule of law. They understood that authority didn't have to mean brutality. When the Marshall Plan brought American aid to rebuild Europe, including former enemy nations, many Italians weren't surprised. Giuseppe certainly wasn't. Of course the Americans are helping rebuild, he told his skeptical neighbors. I told you. They're not conquerors. They're different. The strategic wisdom of treating prisoners of war well paid enormous dividends. Italy became a crucial American ally in the Cold War. Former enemy soldiers like Giuseppe became ambassadors for American values in their communities. The goodwill generated by humane treatment lasted generations. America made a choice during World War II. Respond to brutality with brutality or maintain principles even toward enemies. That choice paid dividends for generations. Italian soldiers stopped fighting to the death because surrender meant survival. Former enemies became Cold War allies. The Marshall Plan succeeded because America had already proven its values were genuine. Giuseppe's restaurant wasn't just an anomaly. It was proof of concept. In 1983, a historian from the University of Bologna interviewed Giuseppe for an oral history project. Giuseppe was 72, still running Café Americano with Sophia's help. People ask me if I feel grateful to the Americans, Giuseppe said thoughtfully. That's not quite the right word. Gratitude implies charity. What I feel is respect. They didn't spare my life out of pity. They treated me according to rules, according to principles they genuinely believed in. They showed me that civilization means keeping your humanity, even toward your enemies. I tell my grandchildren about the time I was an enemy prisoner who ran a restaurant in Louisiana. They think I'm making it up. It sounds impossible, but it happened. And it happened because Americans believed that even enemies deserved to be treated as human beings. That belief, that simple, powerful belief, that's what really won the war, not just the battles, the idea behind the battles. Giuseppe Traante died in 1991 at age 80. At his funeral, Sophia read from her father's memoir. The last entry described his first morning at Camp Ruston, drinking coffee given to him by an American guard, realizing that everything he had been told was wrong. In that moment, Giuseppe had written, I stopped being a fascist. I started being simply a man again. Giuseppe Traante raised his hands in surrender on a North African battlefield, expecting death, torture, and slave labor. He had been told Americans were savages without honor or mercy. Instead, he found humanity, respect, the impossible opportunity to run a small restaurant in a Louisiana prison camp, serving coffee to the very guards who watched over him. He found men like Sergeant Tom O'Brien, men who showed him photos of their families and treated him not as an enemy, but as another man far from home. This wasn't just American military doctrine. This was American character. Giuseppe returned to Italy transformed. He spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen about the Americans who proved that enemies could become friends, that principles mattered even in war, that civilization meant maintaining humanity even toward the defeated. He expected change. He got a chance. And that made all the difference. If you're a veteran, or if your father, uncle, or grandfather served in World War II, they had stories like this. Stories of unexpected humanity in impossible circumstances. Share those stories in the comments before they're lost forever. These aren't just history, they're lessons we still desperately need. Next time, we'll explore another story of an enemy who expected the worst and found something else entirely. The German pilot shot down over Texas who helped build the town's first hospital. Until then, remember Giuseppe's lesson. How we treat our enemies defines not just who we are in war, but who we become in peace.